I was trained as a scholar of American Jewish literature, and the starting point for this project was thinking about and recognizing that Jews played incredibly influential roles in the history of American publishing, and that Jewish families founded many of the most significant publishing houses. So could I have the first slide? Is that possible? Okay, so that's just a slide of logos of publishing houses founded by Jewish families. Some of them are the biggest publishing companies in the world, like Random House. Some of them are the most prestigious publishing houses we have in this country, like Knopf and Farrar, Strauss and Giroux. Some of them are the most innovative and influential in terms of literary experimentalism or representing diverse voices, like the Feminist Press or FC2 or Akashic Books. And that's a fact, the fact that these companies were all started by Jewish families, that rarely comes up even among the people I hang out with who are scholars of American literature, right? Even people who study this field rarely talk about who started the companies or who ran the companies or who were the people behind the literature that we study. One group of people that does typically like to talk about how many Jews are in influential positions in the culture industries is anti-Semites. And I feel like because I'm standing here and a lot of you are students, I can say that we've had a little bit of a discussion of this in the last couple of days with a particularly prominent figure in American culture who's been saying some really unfortunate stuff about Jews and the media, control of the media. But that certainly he wasn't the first person to think of this. And I will say that the starting point for my research for this project came from a white supremacist neo-Nazi website that had all sorts of information about Jews who worked in publishing, and I was interested to sort of follow up on that and see what was at stake there. But it isn't just anti-Semites and confused people who make these claims about Jews in the media. It's also some more mainstream literary figures. Can you go to the next slide? Like, for instance, people like Jack Kerouac and Catherine Ann Porter and Mario Puzo, and also most famously Truman Capote. And this is a quote that Capote gave to Playboy magazine in 1968. He says, "There's this thing called the Jewish Mafia in American letters. It's a clique of New York-oriented writers and critics who control much of the literary scene through the influence of the quarterlies and intellectual magazines. All these publications are Jewish-dominated, and this particular coterie employs them to make or break writers by advancing or withholding attention." And it's not just people like anti-Semitic people, and I think Truman Capote probably in this moment is being kind of anti-Semitic. But if you look around, there's another group of people who like to talk about how prominent Jews are in publishing, and that's people who really like Jews. Could I have the next slide? And what you see when you look at such people is they make sometimes outlandish and absurd and incredible claims about how much Jewish people love to read. So this is an article from the magazine Publishers Weekly, which if you don't work in publishing, you probably don't know, but it's like the industry magazine for publishers, and it's from the late 70s, and it's from an article which says, amazingly, that the estimates range anywhere from 33 to 70% of all buyers of hardcover books and quality paperbacks are Jewish. And once for a conference, just for fun, I did the math on a napkin of how many Jewish people are in the country and how many books are sold every year. And if Jewish people bought 70% of all the books in the country, it would mean every single Jewish person, every baby and every old person, would have to buy 7,000 books. So it's definitely not true. And it's weird that they said that, but there are these ideas that circulate even among Jewish people about Jews loving literature and caring about this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And what's fascinating, too, is that you also get people, Jewish people themselves, in the publishing industry who are kind of upset about what's happening in publishing who say similar things. So could I have the next slide? So this is an ad from the New York Times that was put there by an author whose name is Meyer Levin, who was, a Jewish writer who wrote stories about American Jews and Jews all over the world. And the headline, you probably can't read the whole article of this ad. It was like a half-page ad in the New York Times. It said, "Can a literary mafia affect your choice of books?" And he basically felt like there was this group of people who were stopping his books from getting read. And can I have the next one? This guy is a writer named, Richard Castellanetz, and this book that he wrote in the 70s called The End of Intelligent Writing is about 450 pages of densely argued and highly footnoted work making this claim that there's a group of Jewish writers controlling American publishing. He himself is Jewish, but he didn't really like the people who he thought were in power. Now, responsible scholars and historians, like serious people, knowing how dangerous this kind of thing to talk about, usually what they do is they just don't talk about it at all, right? They just don't mention it. They just pretend it doesn't exist. And that's also, I want to point out, what you hear if you ask people who are powerful people in contemporary publishing. Can I have the next slide? So a while ago now, it seems like a while ago, especially to the young people in the room, in 2013, I asked the fiction editor of The New Yorker, whose name is Deborah Treisman. And I don't know if there are any young writers in the room, but if there are, you'll say that the number one thing you would dream of doing is publishing a short story in The New Yorker. Yeah? Yeah? Yeah. So I asked her, does it matter that you yourself and the editor of the magazine, David Remnick, are of Jewish descent in terms of what you choose and in terms of who you publish? And she said, very elegantly, my aim is to be receptive to fiction that is powerful, eloquent, and original, regardless of its plot or preoccupations. We try to cast the net very wide when it comes to what we publish, and what we look for in a story is, of course, evidence of talent and inspiration rather than ethnic, cultural, or religious concerns, right? And that's very natural and normal. That's what you'd expect to hear. At the same time, I'll say it seems impossible. Taste, as much work in the field of sociology has shown, particularly that following a sociologist, a French sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu, taste is not some magical thing that we pull out of the air and decide on ourselves. It has a lot to do with where you come from, who your parents are, what your community is like, what your gender is, what your sexuality is, and so many other qualities of your identity. And if you don't believe me that taste is a thing that comes from where you are, just look at what you wear, think about the choices you make, about how you look today, what you put on today. Think about how specifically that would change if you had grown up in a totally different place or a different time. So to me, what Deborah Treisman said is not really convincing. Any editor, any decision maker in culture is going to be kind of biased in favor of some work and against some work in choosing what they do. So what I try to do in my scholarship, when I study questions like this about the influence of an ethnic group of American Jews in American culture, is to follow the advice of an intellectual historian named David Hollinger. And what he says is you have to keep in mind, quote, the internal diversity of ethno-racial groups and the contingent historically specific character of the culture these communities present to the larger society at any given moment. And what that means, in short, is just because you know someone is Jewish, that doesn't mean you can predict how they'll feel or what they'll think or what choices they'll make. But there might be some patterns that appear in Jews' behavior depending on many aspects of who they were and where they lived and all of these other factors. I use that approach to think about Jews in the American publishing industry in my book, and particularly what I'm interested in looking at is what are the actual effects of Jewish people having this influence when they're such a small minority group in the country and they're making decisions for so many people. What I wanted to know when I started the project, what choices they made and how did it affect what got published. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is just give a couple of examples of particular cases that I found, and hopefully that'll help give you a sense. And I'll just say the way that I did this project is I spent about 10 years going to publishers' archives and pulling out thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of documents to see what they said about the books they published and the books they didn't publish. And I'm going to show you on the screen a lot of the stuff that I went to archives and took pictures of. So the two editors I'm going to talk about first, and for a little while, both worked at the publishing company Knopf, which is still to this day one of the most prestigious and prominent publishing imprints in the country. I think if you're one of those young writers in the room and you're thinking about who would publish your first book, if Knopf said that it would publish it, you'd be pretty thrilled. The company was founded in 1915 by a Jewish family. The founder's name was Alfred Knopf, and his wife, Blanche Knopf, was a co-founder, and so was his dad, Samuel Knopf. And they founded the house in 1915 as young people, like in their early 20s, and quickly turned it into like one of the most prominent publishing companies in the country. But I want to talk not about them, the founders of the company, but an editor-in-chief named Harold Strauss, who most people have never heard of and has never been talked about. He was the editor-in-chief at Knopf from 1942 until 1966. And he's like in histories, like publishing histories, he's like mentioned in one sentence, even though he was like the editor-in-chief for 20 years. To tell you a little bit about him, he was born in 1907. He went to the Horace Mann School in New York, which is still a well-known school. He went to Harvard, and then he worked at a couple other publishing houses, and then he got hired to work at Knopf in the late 1930s. There's really like very little biographical information about him. No one is like, I don't think there's a Wikipedia page. There's almost nothing about him and almost nothing on Wikipedia. But what I was able to find to help figure out who this guy was stuff that he wrote before and after taking the job. In the 1930s, just before and then after he retired at Knopf, he was writing book reviews for the New York Times, and he was unbelievably prolific. In the year 1934 alone, he published 23 book reviews in the New York Times. That's like one, every other week. And what I could do is I could read through his book reviews to get a sense of what he liked and what he favored and what he liked less. He reviewed a ton of European literature in translation from German, but also French, Italian, Norwegian, and Spanish, as well as like modernist Anglo-American literature, and he particularly loved William Faulkner and James Joyce's Ulysses. He thought was the greatest novel of all time, and he wasn't alone in that. He also reviewed a lot of Jewish literature, including books by Stefan Zweig, Arnold Zweig, Meyer Levin, Arthur Koestler, Albert Halper, Hillel Bernstein. He seems particularly to have been drawn to work that drew on folk materials and on work that showed Jews as like a persecuted group in Eastern Europe, which in the 30s they were. Reviewing a translation of Judith Singer's Yiddish novel Yosha Kald in 1933, which was translated into English as The Singer. He praises it as, quote, illuminating the folk ways of a people, and he said, quote, it is impossible in a brief space to indicate how burdened is this book with the long and tragic history of the Jews. Right, so those stories of like an ethnic group suffering, in particular his own group, they were appealing. Another thing that I want to mention about his reviews is that he seems to have rejected the idea of a conflict between Jewish and national identity. And what I mean by that is that he reviewed a book called My Life as a German and a Jew by a writer named Jakob Wassermann. And what he said there is that this particular writer wrote that book because he felt like, as you could imagine a Jew in Germany feeling, like to be a Jew and to be a German were opposed terms, and they sort of like didn't work together. What Strauss writes, though, is that that's a problem that's not generalizable. He says, quote, the problem that tortured Wassermann is not one applicable to Jews in general, but specifically the problem of a somewhat mystical Jewish poet who writes in German. So what Strauss is saying is that like a conflict between your national identity, like let's say you're feeling of yourself as an American and you're feeling as yourself as a Jew, is not my problem. It's not a problem that I have. And when he came to work at Knopf, Strauss brought all these beliefs with him. So I'm going to first give you one example of the kind of book that he loved to publish and that like he really should be recognized for doing amazing work for. And the category that he really liked is European Jewish literature. And particularly he published Yiddish literature in translation and was one of the pioneering American editors who did that. So I think I have a bunch of slides, of like the books that he published. This is a book by the novelist Judith Singer called The Brothers Ashkenazi, which was an enormous bestseller for Knopf, and they followed that up. That was like 1936, and like the next one is, The River Breaks Up in 1938, and then there was another one a year later. I think I have all these, East of Eden, and then another one. This is a book that they published in 1948, which is a whole book about the Yiddish writer Yud Lamed Peretz, who is a major Yiddish writer, and this is the first major book in English about him. And the next one was the very first novel published by the future Nobel Prize-winning Yiddish writer Isaac Bashevis Singer, which they published in 1950. What's noticeable about that, right, is that Strauss, this guy, Harold Strauss, he saw Yiddish literature as valuable when it could be construed as part of European high-prestige literature, which had always been one of Knopf's specialties and was something that he clearly was hired to do. And I'll show you a couple examples from the books of like how I know that that's what he was thinking about. So this is like a little blurb from inside one of these books, like one of the I.J. Singer books, and it says, I.J. Singer has also written this other book, and then it's a quote that says, it can be compared with Tolstoy's War and Peace without condescension. Right? So that's explicitly Knopf saying this Yiddish novel is kind of like Tolstoy, this great Russian writer. I think there's one more. Yeah, and this is, it's probably hard to see, but this is inside like one of the books that they published. One of the Yiddish books, it says, great novels from many tongues, and it lists like books by like world-renowned writers like Thomas Mann and Willa Cather as the American, and it basically contextualizes Yiddish as a great world literary language, right? But the thing I'll say about Strauss is that he seemed to have, not seemed to, he really had no interest in Yiddish writing or Jewish writing when it had to do with life in America. I'm a scholar of Yiddish literature, right? And like tons of Yiddish writing was about like becoming being an immigrant to America, being poor, working in a sweatshop, dealing with all those like problems that immigrants deal with. And he had no patience for that, no interest in it. And one of the places that I could like locate a sense of how he felt about all this was when in 1951 he was sent a book that was an anthology of essays about Jewish life in America. So can you go to the next slide? So this is the first report that came in. This is from the Knopf archives by a publicity director named Bill Cole, who is a non-Jewish guy, when this book of like, short articles about Jewish life in America came across his desk. And basically the publicity director said, oh, this is amazing. It's so great. It's going to be an amazing book. And the last line, can you go to the next slide? It's probably still hard to see. The last line of his report says, it should be of great interest to all Jews, to intelligent, inquiring Gentiles, and perhaps even to the goy polloi. Okay, to understand that joke, which I'm guessing most people in this room don't, hoi polloi is a way of saying like the average person, and the word goy is a Jewish word for non-Jew. So he's making this like cute joke to say everyone's going to like this book. Strauss responded to this, and he just totally disagreed. Can you give me the next slide, please? He agreed that like this is a good book, it's well written, there's like good stuff in it, but what he says is the Jewish market has become quite a good one, but only when a book coincides with one of the major Jewish emotional orientations. For example, the establishment of the State of Israel, the extermination of the Jews of Central Europe, clinical studies of and attacks on the causes of anti-Semitism. And he said, this project about American Jews fits into none of these major categories. So just to translate that for a second, what he's saying is you can sell a Jewish book if it's about the Holocaust or Israel or anti-Semitism. But that's it. And he went on to say that his own perspective, like how his own perspective informed his idea about this. He wrote, it has strong nostalgic values for some of us, but it treats the Jews as separate communities in America, and many Jews are unwilling to think of themselves in that way. Finally, although the book is likely to get a very good press, I cannot imagine that there will be any great number of non-Jews, Mr. Cole's example notwithstanding, who will be interested enough to buy it. So when he says many Jews are unwilling to think of themselves as separate communities in America, that's like the exact same thing he was saying about that German writer that I talked about a few minutes ago. He's saying, I'm a Jew, I'm an American, these things are like totally, they work together, and this collection makes me feel like Jews are being othered, like they're being separated. The thing I really want to point out about that is something that's really true about publishers in general, which is that they know absolutely nothing about what the market looks like, and they're only guessing, and mostly what they spend their time doing is projecting their own ideas about what they want to read onto a presumed market, right? The way that they make the decision is they say, oh, people don't want to buy this or read this, but really what they're doing is expressing their own sense of what is right or wrong. And I could talk a lot more about that, but that's like one example of how a Jewish editor, working at a very prestigious mainstream American publishing house, probably the most prestigious one in America, made choices about what he wanted to do. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about another editor who also worked at Knopf, but much later. This editor's name might be familiar to some people in the room if there's any writers who came into the room. He's one of the editors who might be known. His name is Gordon Lish, and he worked at Knopf starting in the late 1970s until the late 1980s. And he's most famous, like if he comes up in an American literature class, he would come up as the editor of Raymond Carver's short stories, because he's known for having been like basically taking this famous writer's stories and cutting them down by more than half and creating the famous style that sort of helped to make that writer succeed. But what most people don't know about Gordon Lish is his engagement with Jewish stuff, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Can I have the next? Oh, no, go one back. Sorry. Thank you for, you're doing a great job. All right, so this is what people don't know about him is this side of him, which this is a letter from the writer Cynthia Ozick where she says, she calls him Der Knopfer Rebbe, right? She gives him this like Yiddish title as like the rabbi of Knopf because she believes so much in him. I could literally talk about Gordon Lish for many, many hours. He is a very colorful, in many ways problematic, and in some ways troubling character. But the one thing I want to talk about here is how he saw himself as a Jewish editor and how he sought out a certain group of Jewish writers to support and publish. He was born in 1934. He grew up on Long Island. He went to Phillips Academy, which is like a sort of fancy boarding school, but he got kicked out for fighting, and he says because of an anti-Semitic incident. He worked as a radio DJ. He got married. He ended up in Arizona. Then he went to Northern California, hung out with the Beats. He's an interesting guy. He was very, very conscious of his own Jewishness because he entered the editorial field not with book publishers, but in little magazines, like sort of hip avant-garde magazines. And his feeling of that field was that the people in power were Ivy League-trained Protestants like George Plimpton and the poet and editor Reed Whittemore. And I'm going to do something that I almost never do now, which is play you a little clip of a phone interview I did with Lish. I hate to hear the sound of my own voice, but I'm going to bear with it because I think it's fun to hear me asking Lish about this. So could you go to the next slide? And hopefully this is going to work. This is, I asked him about, I asked him, well, you'll hear what I asked him and you'll hear what he says. Can you play it? Let's see if it works. Are we not hooked up to sound there? Okay. I think it's okay if you can't do it. Yeah, okay, so I guess the sound didn't work, but that's okay. I will tell you, and you can email me if you want to hear what it sounds like for me to talk to Gordon Lish. The first day, so he had been working at this small magazine that he founded in Palo Alto called Genesis West. He wrote this incredible letter which all students should read because he basically got this highly prestigious job just on the basis of one letter that he wrote. They didn't know who he was and he had no credentials and he just like talked himself into being a fiction editor at Esquire. And I asked him about how he felt about himself as a Jewish writer, and he told me a story that on his first day in the Esquire office, the fiction editor who was like turning over the reins to him, who was leaving, called out so that everyone in the office could hear that there was a novelist on the phone named Louis Strauss, who was like like the highest WASP Protestant, like fancy boarding school type writer. And he said, Louis is on the phone, and he would like to know what nationality is the name Lish. Like, so it was like asking about what ethnicity he was, sort of calling out to the fact that he was a Jewish guy working in this job. That was his first day on the job. And I talked to him a lot about like how he felt about this. One of the other quotes that I would have played for you is he called it an us and them paradigm, where there were some people like me and there were some people like those Protestants who felt like I didn't belong there. The same year in 1970, this is another example of how Lish was positioned. He passed along for consideration for his bosses an excerpt of a novel by a novelist named Wallace Markfield, which is called Teitelbaum's Window. And Lish was really excited about it. He was like, we should do an excerpt of this in the magazine. But he wrote self-consciously a note about, and you can see this there if you have very good eyes, I guess. He was self-conscious about the density of the Yiddish and the extent to which it limits the audience. His boss, a non-Jew named Don Erickson, wrote back to say that he could, quote, see as many reasons for doing it as not doing it. As for the latter, one major might be that, God damn it, it's time now the Jews stop yammering on in this way. So, and I asked him, when I talked to Gordon Lish, like, do you think Don Erickson was joking? And he was like, no, he was really just saying, like, Jews should shut up. It's enough already with their, like, Yiddish accented English. This sort of resistance did not deter Lish. He was a very contrarian kind of figure, and it seems to me that it, like, spurred him on. When I asked him, like, how he thought about Jewish writers, what he said was, quote, one had a weather eye out for Jewish writers by name, and once one had entered into the work, one found reasons to keep on looking at it. What's interesting, though, is that the Jewish writers that Gordon Lish published weren't the ones, the most famous ones, or the ones you might think of. He did publish writers like Philip Roth and Isaac Bashevis Singer a little bit, but the writers that he really loved were Grace Paley, Harold Brodkey, Harold Bloom, Leonard Michaels, Stanley Elkin, and especially, and what I'll just emphasize for a second, is that he had an astonishing close and supportive relationship with the novelist and essayist Cynthia Ozick. If you don't know Cynthia Ozick's work, it's incredibly dense, Jewish, complex stuff. It's amazing, it's fascinating, and if you don't have a grounding in Hebrew and Yiddish and all the other things that go into, like, Jewish culture, it can be like a bit of a slog and a little challenging. They loved each other. They wrote hundreds of letters back and forth. And I can't imagine that Ozick had anyone who supported her more in American literature than Gordon Lish. When he was a fiction editor at Esquire in the 1970s, she sent him this story called Usurpation, which I, like, can't even describe to you what it's about. It's about, like, a Jewish writer being influenced by older Jewish writers who wrote in Hebrew, who were influenced by older Jewish writers who wrote in Hebrew, like, during, like, the Spanish Golden Age, who were influenced by older Jewish writers who wrote in Hebrew hundreds of years before that. It's like an intense story. And what she wrote to him in a letter when she sent it to him, maybe this one you can see. Let's see. That's Cynthia Ozick. She said, I wrote this whole story. I was thinking about sending it to you. And then she says, then I looked at the story and I saw that it cannot possibly be for Esquire because it is A, too long, and B, too Jewish. So she like knew that. And by the way, like, if you've seen Esquire, you get it. Like, Esquire? Weird. But he published it. He was so excited about this work that he got it into this mass magazine that was known for many other things. When that happened, she wrote him another letter that I don't have a picture of, and she said, quote, I know and you know that there is no other fiction editor of a big general magazine who would have the guts to publish a story as profoundly Jewish as this one. He did so much other stuff for Cynthia Ozick through the 70s and later. The other example I have, if you can put it up, I think, she sent in a really strange and intense essay to Esquire in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War in Israel-Palestine, and he said to his bosses, this is an internal memo he sent to his bosses, I will hear quarrels against Ozick's prose here and there, the staging, the organization, but that is about all. She is saying something I feel, every Jew really feels, is undeniably true. And I just use that as an example to show that Lish was saying, like, my own positionality as a Jew, that's, like, why I need to publish this essay. Like, it's so important to me. I could talk about him so much more, but, like, the main thing I want to say about Gordon Lish in this context, right, is how different he was than Harold Strauss. Lish said explicitly that he didn't want to publish any writers in translation. He said they're not interesting to him. He barely ever did it. He was not at all interested in European high prestige writing as sort of more important. What he cared about was a certain kind of prose style, a certain kind of, like, interesting, complex way of writing in English, and that's what drew him to the Jewish writers that he published. And I give these two examples to give a sense how knowing that they're Jewish really matters and really makes a difference in thinking about their editorial record, but it doesn't tell you in advance about, like, what they would like or what they would gravitate towards. And I'm going to give one final example and then, wrap up, and you can ask me questions and I can tell you more. And the final example I'm going to give you, this comes at the very beginning of the book, is the National Book Awards. So as you might know, many people in the room might know, there are two major American book prizes. You have Pulitzer Prizes and the National Book Awards. And one of the things that I noticed when I was working on this book is that Jews did really, really, really well in the National Book Awards from the 1950s to the 1970s. And the National Book Awards, to be clear, are like for everyone. It's for the whole nation. It is meant to be a national prize. And that prize, the National Book Award for Fiction, was awarded to a Jewish author writing about a Jewish subject in 1954, 1959, 1960, 1965, 1967, 1969, 1970, and 1974. So that's 8 times in 20 years, or almost 50% of all the prizes in those 2 decades. The prize went to Saul Bellow 3 times, Bernard Malamud twice, Philip Roth, Jerzy Kosinski, Isaac Bashevis Singer. And one of the questions that seemed worth asking to me when I thought about Jewish power and control in the publishing industry was whether Jewish judges had been the ones giving the prizes to all those Jewish writers. And happily, I could find out who all the judges were and look them up and figure out what their stories were. And the answer is no, Jewish writers and critics were not the ones giving those prizes to Jewish writers. There were some Jewish judges of the prize, but in those years, when there was a Jewish judge, for the most part, they gave prizes to writers like James Jones, Wright Morris, Walker Percy, and J.F. Powers. There was only one year in that whole period, between the 50s and the 70s, where I found a majority of Jewish judges on the panel, and that was in 1953. The judges that year, that's great, the judges that year were Martha Foley, who was a non-Jewish journalist who edited Story magazine, a guy named Howard Mumford Jones, who was a non-Jewish English professor, and 3 young Jewish intellectual writers, Alfred Kazin, Irving Howe, and Saul Bellow, who are right there. They had, can you go to the next slide? This committee had a whole bunch of books to choose from. The finalists, there were 11 finalists, which included Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, books by Gene Stafford, John Steinbeck, William Carlos Williams, as well as a really interesting and neglected and kind of unknown American Jewish novel by a writer named Peter Martin with the worst title that a Jewish novel has ever had. It's called The Landsman, which is bad Yiddish. It should be called The Landslight, but that's another story. They could have given the prize, if they wanted to give it to a Jewish writer, to that. But, as some people might know, the book that won the National Book Award for Fiction in 1953 was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And giving the National Book Award to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man was a major event in American literary history, in African American literary history, and American literary history writ large. It was one of the only times in between the 1950s and the 1980s that a major American literary prize went to a black writer. And if you look at people who study the history of African American literature, they will tell you that this prize absolutely changed the course of that field and influenced many writers and things like that. Now you could say that there's collusion at work, there's a conspiracy at work here, because it turns out that of those Jewish guys who were the judges of the prize, they were good friends of Ralph Ellison's, and they hung out together, and they really liked his work. And also, they all published in the same journals, and they all talked to each other. So there probably was some sense of something kind of quote-unquote unfair. But I think it's interesting and indicative that what happened when Jewish writers got together and expressed their values in a major organ of American literature, what happened wasn't that they picked a sort of mediocre novel about Jewish life, which they literally had as a finalist and could have picked, but they decided to pick, for all the reasons that you could get into, a writer from another minority tradition who they were sympathetic to because what he was trying to do resonated with their own project and what they were thinking about. I hope I've given you a sense of all the very different ways, not all, but some of the very different ways that American Jews' literary influences could play out depending on who the individuals were and the situations they were in. I'll mention that there's a lot in the book that I have not talked about. And I look at a lot of other dynamics in terms of sort of influence and power in the U.S. literary system. There's a chapter about professors and their students and how it matters, like who gets to be a professor and which students they support. There's a chapter about women and men, where I talk about what happens in an industry when there are a lot of women who are aspiring to rise and a lot of men who have the power to decide whether they do. And I don't probably have to tell most of the people in this room that what happens in that situation is pretty unpleasant and unfortunate. And there's a chapter about parents and children, because one of the things that happens when Jews rise to positions of influence and power in American culture is that their kids have a much easier road to success. And I look at the ways that that works out for better and worse for a lot of younger Jewish writers since the 70s, 80s, and 90s whose parents were already successful in the fields they were in. As varied as all these cases are, and as many different things as we can say about it, I want to close by trying to reflect on why I thought this study was relevant to the moment that we're in now, and what it has to teach us about publishing now. What I'll say is there's no question that Jews invested heavily in American publishing and American literature, and financially and other ways, and that this benefited them in many different ways over the course of the 20th century. We can't talk about that in a simple way to say that it's a Jewish literary mafia running the field, but we also really shouldn't pretend it doesn't matter who gets to be in those roles, right? It's too important, and it makes too much of a difference to say that it just doesn't matter. Once we recognize how powerful it was that Jews played this kind of force shaping the development of American literature, it should start to seem pretty obvious that more of that influence needs to be shared with people from other backgrounds. Anyone who studies the history of American literature should know, or does know, how much of a difference it made when Toni Morrison was hired as an editor at Random House. That so many of the African-American women writers that we have because Toni Morrison got that job and had the platform to advance Black women's writing. We also know that publishing has an incredibly difficult time with diversity, and that it's way too white of an industry still today, and that people in publishing will talk your ear off about how important it is and how necessary it is that they have more diverse voices. And I could talk more about this, but I think I'll just close with saying that part of where I see the relevance of the Jewish story is that when other minority groups succeed in the field, we can't expect them to do it alone, or as tokens, or as single people fighting the battle by themselves. What you need to hope for, what you need to hope that we can accomplish, is to see groups together, working together, supporting each other, to have the kind of network that Jews had in 20th century publishing, so that they can advance the cause of their own voices being heard and being expressed. So that's why I sort of closed the book by saying that even though there was no such thing as a literary mafia, more literary mafias probably wouldn't be a bad thing. I'll stop there. Thanks so much. Okay, so here's the amazing secret. You can too. It's open to anyone. What you have to do, all that stuff from Knopf, here's my recommendation. You got to go to Austin, Texas, get yourself a nice Airbnb, and then email the people at the Ransom Center, which is the Special Collections Library at the University of Texas at Austin. They have more than 3,000 boxes of the files of the Knopf Publishing Company. And if you have a favorite writer who is published by Knopf, you can go in and see what the editor said, what they liked about the work, what they didn't like about the work, because it's all just there. And the truth is, any other publishing company's archives are also open. Farrar, Strauss, and Giroux's are at the New York Public Library. Houghton Mifflin's are at Harvard. These companies, amazingly and wonderfully, give over their records so that scholars like me can work on them. The only thing I'll say about that, though, that is that you have to be careful of, is that Knopf was particular, and the reason it ends up being such a big force in my book is that I think we know we have to turn right. It's okay. No, it's fine. It happens to me. No, what I'll say is that most publishing companies still today, although maybe a little less today, when they have a meeting, when they want to determine whether they're going to publish something, they do it in a meeting, and usually they don't take like careful notes of it. So mostly, a lot of the decision making in publishing has been lost because just people don't have a record of it. What's great about Knopf is that nobody liked each other, and they never wanted to be in the same room. So the way they considered manuscripts is that they would have a stack of, the book manuscript, and they'd send it from office to office with a piece of paper on top where everyone would write their comments on it. So they actually have a written record of their deliberations about the books, and that makes it a very special case. Usually when I go to other publishers, it's just harder to find that kind of information. Yeah. Please. It's a great question, and I think the answer is yes to some degree, right? Because even the amount of stuff that I did to try to get a kind of bird's eye view of the publishing industry really was tens of thousands of documents and took me a long time. And to do the same level, like the way you'd really do with a real baseline study, I don't think I mean, I guess I could have. It was 10 more years. But what you can do, right, is look for comparison cases and try to find answers to that question. So I'll give you an example that was like important to me. When I say that Knopf in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and early 60s, when Harold Strauss was working there, wasn't interested in American Jewish writing, I said to myself, because I'm a scholar of this field, who was publishing American Jewish writing? Was it other Jewish firms, or was it mostly non-Jewish firms? And I went and looked for all the other writers that I knew who were publishing at that time, and I could see where they were publishing, so I could actually make the case clearly that what Knopf was doing wasn't just because no one was publishing that kind of writing, it was that they were studiously avoiding a topic that other publishers who were like them were publishing. So I think like that's a case in which I can get a kind of control, but it's not possible to do it, or it wasn't possible for me to do it like as thoroughly as one might like to do. But I think my general sort of attention to and rooting in American publishing history does help with that. And look, like, I think it's so important. It's something I care about a lot, and there's not. I don't have all the answers. It's not that I know. But what I'll say is, from my study, I think it's really important to do all the things you can to build community with other writers that you see as working in a tradition that's meaningfully like around you. And I think that's true for any writer, but I think especially for writers whose voices, where people from your background haven't gotten the support they need. So I think you probably know, if you're a young writer, you know about things like Kit Canham, or like other kinds of, there's a good Asian American writers workshop. I used to run a workshop, a writing workshop for people interested in writing about Jewish stuff, because I think there's so much value. And I from every writer I know who's done one of those workshops, it can be like really central in building community. I think that's really important. But at the same time, we need those networks to grow larger and to grow more power. So like, I would say it's important to look for the people out there who have positions of influence or power, and really support them in all the ways that you can support someone in a position like that, to point people towards their work, to, in the crazy attention economy we live in, to like post their stuff or whatever, but like really to know that they're doing, that it's important that they succeed, even sometimes when they're letting you down. Because I think what can be the hardest thing when you're in a community and you feel like other writers are connected to you is that often they're not going to do exactly what you want them to do, or that you're not going to agree. And to see that there's a value still in like connecting and in building like centers of power. But I also, I just really feel like we need more publishing houses led by people who have not had opportunities to lead publishing houses before. And we see a little bit of that in New York publishing right now. And I think like someone like Lisa Lucas needs like us all to like get out there and buy the books she's publishing. And we need to like show our support for change in the industry so that people understand that that's possible. I like we should just keep talking about this all day. So like we should brainstorm more ideas to address this because I think it is like really the crucial thing right now. Yeah. I am not an expert in this field, but my answer is there are some, and I will say though that I do not know of one that is as large or has the reach and the support in a really, what if you know anything about contemporary publishing, you know that it's consolidating into there are basically four large, 5 and maybe soon 4 large publishing companies left in America. So there are imprints, there are small publishing houses, but right, like when you think of many of the part of the issue is like most of the most successful novels and memoirs and literary works by African American writers that we know were published by companies not owned by African American people, so those profits did not go to them. And I think that that's something that we have to look for happening in the future that, again, is even with the ascension of someone like Lisa Lucas to a position of prominence in the industry, we're not seeing that ownership piece of it yet. I don't know that I see a direct connection between like innovation or technological change in the industry and demographics in the industry. In the 20th century, in the period I study, there's a lot of change of like paperback, the introduction of mass market paperbacks and the introduction of trade paperbacks and lots of expansion of the industry in all sorts of different ways. And I think that, well, you know what, I'm stepping back though. Some of the changes in the industry, like another big change that happened between 1950 and 2000 in American publishing is like what happened with gender. In 1950, if you were a woman and you wanted to work in publishing, I hope you enjoy being a secretary. In 2000, women are 80% of the entire workforce of the publishing industry. So that's a huge change. And one of the engines of that change, someone should write a book about this, by the way, if you're looking for a project. But one of the engines of that change was exactly change in the dynamics of the publishing industry. So like a lot of women who rose to like really high positions of prominence, they had been working in fields that like before the 1970s were kind of like not a big deal or not like very high prestige, but that became more prestigious. And the particular one that I think was really powerful was foreign rights. That foreign rights agents, like people who worked in publishing houses to like deal with foreign rights, it wasn't seen as very important, but then it grew to be much, much, much more important. And that was like an engine of change for women. So it is possible, right? Like if I'm just, I'm thinking of this theoretically, like if a publishing house looking to diversify hires a bunch of young people from more diverse backgrounds to like, let's say like scout the Insta poets, which is like a thing that's happening right now, and then Insta poetry becomes much, 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 much bigger, there is a chance that that could help, that it could like advance the cause. But I don't think that's inevitable because these, like the big conglomerates and corporations that run publishing are like pretty good at like exploiting and taking profits and, that whole thing. Yeah, like why did I spend 10 years doing this? It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Part of it really comes from, I don't know if anybody here is an English major, but I was an English major in college. And you read all these books and no one talks about who publishes them. And even people who love literature and care about it, and like, I mean, I sometimes do this group, do it here, like, you don't actually have to put your hands up. But like, if I say to you, like, think of the best book you've read in the last 6 months, right? Think of it in a second. And then I say, do you know the author? And everybody nods. Do you know the title of the book? Most people nod. Do you know the publisher of the book? Nobody nods, right? Nobody really cares about publishing. And it seemed to me, once I started to see that like Random House was started by Jewish people, the other thing I'll say that's like was an inspiration for this project is that a topic in which this kind of study already exists and is pretty well known is in Hollywood. So like many people know, and there's been a lot written about the Hollywood studios and what it means that Jewish people were the founders of them. And like there's lots of great books about like how that affected the Hollywood studios' relationship to Nazi Germany and how that affected what movies got made and stuff like that. So partly it's because I was like reading in that area and I was like looking around for where's the book that talks about this in the publishing industry, and I decided to sort of keep going with it. It's an interesting question. It's an academic book. It has like 80 pages of endnotes. And they're really good. There's like really interesting stuff in those endnotes. But I know that most people aren't going to read those. And I also didn't know until they told me it was happening that it was going to be an audiobook, which is a really weird experience to have. Because like I would have probably written it differently if they had told me someone was going to read it out loud. But that's fine. In general, like the people that I most want to reach with this book, like, you know, most is scholars of American literature, because I just think it's really important that you recognize this history if you're going to study this field. But I also really wanted to reach writers, young writers, and people who work in publishing, because I think that a lot of the questions about like fairness, merit, unfairness, you know, nepotism that I deal with in this book are really relevant to writers. And then, you know, if other people want to read the book, I think it's wonderful. That's great. But I can't make any promises. I will tell you that, like, this was my second, you know, I already got tenure before this book came out. So a thing that I really tried to do in this book is be funny. And I'll tell you one thing that I did that I'm so proud of, and that, like, if you don't read my book, you won't know. So the title of the book, I knew was going to be The Literary Mafia, like, by, like, 2011, like, when I began working on this. And I, like, in my bio, in things that I published, it was like, the next book he's working on is called The Literary Mafia. And then in 2017, I was in the archive, like in a random archive at Queens College for this writer, Anne Burstein, who I write about in the book, but I haven't talked about today. And I found a random letter that she got from someone else, which gives me the epigraph for the book, which I'll read to you, which is, perhaps some smart-ass fellow should write a book called The Literary Mafia. Yeah, what I'll say about the title of the book is that, right, the common things people said, and I'm guessing it's possible you came in a little late from the talk, which is okay if it's true, or maybe I was not that compelling. But Capote, right, said literally, he used that term. He said there's a Jewish literary mafia. Jack Kerouac said Jewish literary mafia. Other people use that term explicitly, and that's part of where I get it from. But some of the pushback I've gotten some weird pushback on this book. I can talk about it later. Was someone said, you know, oh, but you say, and it like says on the inside flap of the book, there's no such thing as a literary mafia. So why would you give it that title? And the idea that, like, what animates that for me is that, of course, there's no actual mafia, right? There's no actual collusion. The people who work in publishing, they really don't get together and scheme. But they also aren't objective, meritocratic automatons who have no feelings. They do favors for their friends. They do favors for their loved ones. They care about their kids. They care about the cultures they come from. They use all the things that you would expect them to use in making decisions. And I think that there is some cheekiness in the title, but it's that we need to, like, accept that facet of publishing. We need to, like, be willing to accept that like people's personalities are going to come into it if we want it ever to like have any kind of just outcomes. We need to like accept that. So I think that's part of why the title is there. Yeah, it's interesting to say. I mean, Ellison is a, I don't know how many people have read Invisible Man. If you haven't, please do. It is a book that itself is like engaged with a kind of like how particularistic, how universalistic is this experience. And for that reason, it's been to some degree controversial within like African American literary circles. The best way I can explain it, the best way I can understand it, is it captured the kind of ambivalence, intensity that those Jewish intellectuals felt in that moment of wanting to be able to speak as Jews, but not wanting to be like forced to speak as Jews, to have this sort of complex relationship to your identity where you want to be in control of it and not let others. And I think Ellison's book, to me, speaks of that, of wanting not to reject or slough off an identity, but to slough off the sort of way it's imposed on you and forced on you, like the stereotypes and mistreatment. So I think that that's what they were probably celebrating in it. And there is something universalistic about that, because kind of everyone from every minority group does want that. They want to be able to be in control of the way that they're understood. And I don't know how different or similar that is to this moment. I think that there are a lot of people, a lot of very good-natured, people of goodwill in publishing who really want to get outside themselves and like help other voices get expression. And often it probably does come from a place that's a little bit like that. Yeah.